The wind howled through the Wyoming wilderness like 1,000 tortured souls, but Wyatt Daniels barely heard it over the pounding of his own heart. He'd been riding for 3 days straight through the December blizzard of 1876, his supplies dwindling and his hope along with them. As the snow swirled around him, obscuring everything beyond a few feet, he knew he was lost, and that his chances of reaching Laramie before nightfall had vanished like summer heat on the frontier. "Easy, Thunder," Wyatt murmured to his stallion as the horse whinnied nervously, ears flattening against the biting wind. "We'll find shelter soon." The words had barely left his chapped lips when a sound carried through the storm, faint but unmistakable, a baby's cry. Wyatt pulled Thunder to a halt, his gloved hand gripping the reins tighter as he strained to listen. There it was again, a high, desperate wail that no man with a soul could ignore. "Hello," he called out, his voice swallowed by the howling wind. "Anyone there?" When no answer came, he guided Thunder toward the sound, peering through the curtain of snow until he spotted a dark shape huddled against a fallen tree. As he drew closer, the shape revealed itself to be a woman clutching something to her chest, the source of the crying. Wyatt dismounted quickly, his boots sinking into the deep snow as he approached. The woman looked up, her face pale with cold, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. The bundle in her arms squirmed and cried again, a baby, no more than a few months old, its wails growing weaker by the moment. "Madam," Wyatt said, crouching down beside her. "You're freezing out here. Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help us." Without hesitation, Wyatt shrugged off his thick wool coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then reached for the blanket rolled behind his saddle. He unfurled it and carefully wrapped it around both mother and child. "My name's Wyatt Daniels," he said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the dire situation. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe." The woman nodded weakly. "Beatrice," she managed. "Beatrice Bennett, and this is Emma." The baby's cries had quieted to whimpers, but Wyatt could see the blue tinge to both their lips. Night was falling fast, and with it, temperatures that could kill them all. "We need shelter, and we need it now," he said, scanning their surroundings. The storm had worsened, visibility dropping to almost nothing. "Can you stand, Miss Bennett?" she tried but faltered, her legs numb from cold and exhaustion. Without wasting another moment, Wyatt gently lifted both her and the baby into his arms and carried them to Thunder. "I'll get you on first," he said, "and then hand you the baby." Beatrice nodded, her eyes fluttering closed momentarily before she forced them open again. With careful maneuvering, Wyatt helped her onto Thunder's back, then passed the bundled infant up to her. "Hold tight now," he instructed, taking the reins and leading the horse forward on foot. There's got to be shelter somewhere. For what seemed like hours, they trudged through the deepening snow, the only sounds the howling wind, Thunder's labored breathing, and the occasional whimper from Emma. Beatrice remained silent, focused entirely on keeping her baby close to her chest. Just as Wyatt's own strength began to wane, he spotted a dark shape through the snow, a small cabin, abandoned by the look of it, but shelter nonetheless. "There," he said, relief washing over him. "We've found a place." The cabin was barely more than a hunter's shack, with a single room and a stone fireplace that had long since gone cold. But it had 4 walls and a roof, which made it a palace compared to the frozen wilderness outside. Wyatt helped Beatrice and Emma inside, then returned to Thunder to retrieve his saddlebags and what supplies he had left. Once back inside, he set about building a fire, his fingers stiff with cold but driven by urgent necessity. As flames began to lick at the dry kindling, Wyatt turned to check on his companions. Beatrice sat on the floor near the fireplace, still wrapped in his coat and blanket, gently rocking her baby. "She's so cold," Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't warm her." Wyatt moved closer, kneeling beside them. "The fire will help, but we need to share body heat until the cabin warms up." He hesitated, aware of the impropriety of what he was about to suggest. "Miss Bennet, I don't mean to be forward, but please," she interrupted. "I don't care about propriety. I only care about saving my daughter." With a nod, Wyatt sat beside her, opening his arms. Beatrice didn't hesitate, moving closer until she was nestled against his chest, Emma cradled between them. Wyatt wrapped the blanket around all three of them, creating a cocoon of shared warmth. "How did you end up out there?" he asked softly, trying to keep her talking, keep her awake. Beatrice drew a shaky breath. "We were on the stagecoach to Laramie, my husband." Her voice faltered. "My husband died 6 months ago. I was going to live with my sister." She looked down at Emma, whose color was slowly returning as their combined warmth reached her. "The coach was attacked by bandits. They took everything, left us for dead. I started walking, hoping to find the road again, but the snow—" "You're safe now," Wyatt assured her, though he wasn't entirely convinced of it himself. They still had a long night ahead, and his supplies were meager at best. "What about you?" Beatrice asked, her blue eyes meeting his. "What brings a man out alone in weather like this?" Wyatt almost smiled. "Stubbornness, mostly. I've got a small cattle operation outside of Laramie. Was returning from selling some stock in Cheyenne when the storm hit. Thought I could outride it." He shook his head. "Foolish." "Not foolish," Beatrice said softly. "If you hadn't been here." The unfinished thought hung between them as Emma squirmed and made a small, contented sound, finally warm enough to relax. "I have some jerky and hardtack in my saddlebag," Wyatt said after a moment. "Not much of a feast, but it'll keep our strength up." Beatrice nodded. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." Wyatt carefully extracted himself from their huddle, making sure the blanket stayed wrapped snugly around mother and child before retrieving his saddlebag. He returned with the promised food and a canteen of water, which they shared as the fire gradually brought life back to the cabin. Outside, the storm continued unabated, snow piling against the door and windows, the wind finding every crack and crevice in the old cabin walls. But inside, a fragile warmth had begun to build, not just from the fire, but from the unexpected connection forged by survival. As night deepened, Wyatt found himself studying Beatrice's face in the firelight. She was young, perhaps 25, with delicate features strained by grief and hardship. Her hair, now thawing from the snow, was a rich auburn that caught the fire's glow. Despite the circumstances, there was a quiet dignity about her, a strength that had kept her moving through the blizzard when many would have given up. "You should try to sleep," he suggested. "I'll keep the fire going." Beatrice looked hesitant. "What about you?" "I'll rest later," he assured her. "Been through worse nights." She didn't argue, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. With Emma still cradled against her chest, she leaned back against the wall near the fireplace and closed her eyes. Wyatt added more wood to the fire, then settled nearby, his back against the opposite wall, his gaze alternating between the flames and the sleeping forms of mother and child. Outside, Wyoming's winter unleashed its full fury, but inside this humble shelter, 3 lives hung in a delicate balance of shared warmth and borrowed time. As the night wore on, Wyatt found himself reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. He'd been alone for so long, 5 years, since losing his wife and unborn child to fever, that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be responsible for someone else's welfare. Yet here he was, standing between 2 innocent lives and the merciless winter. When Emma began to fuss around midnight, Beatrice stirred, her eyes opening with the immediate alertness of a mother. She's hungry, she murmured, adjusting her position to nurse the infant discreetly beneath the blanket. Wyatt averted his gaze, giving her privacy. How old is she? 4 months, Beatrice replied, her voice soft with maternal love. She was born in August, just 2 months after James passed. Wyatt nodded, understanding the additional weight of her loss. You've been carrying a heavy burden alone. Beatrice looked up at him, surprise in her tired eyes. Most men don't see it that way. Most men haven't lost what I've lost, Wyatt replied simply. Something passed between them, then a silent recognition of shared grief. No further words were needed as Emma nursed and eventually drifted back to sleep, her tiny hand curled against her mother's chest. The rest of the night passed in quiet vigilance, with Wyatt maintaining the fire and occasionally stepping outside to check on Thunder, whom he'd managed to shelter in a lean-to attached to the cabin. By dawn, the storm had begun to subside, though deep snow blanketed everything in sight. When morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, Beatrice was already awake, gently rocking Emma and humming a soft lullaby. She looked up as Wyatt entered from checking outside. How bad is it? She asked. Snow's deep, but the storm's passing, he replied, brushing flakes from his shoulders. We should be able to travel by midday if you're strong enough. Beatrice nodded, but uncertainty flickered across her face. Mr. Daniels, Wyatt, please. Wyatt, she corrected with a small smile. I don't know how to thank you. Emma and I would have died out there, he shook his head. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said firmly. Not anyone, not in this world. She looked down at her daughter. I lost everything to those bandits: money, clothes, even my wedding ring. I have nothing to offer for your help. Wyatt felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. You don't owe me anything, Miss Bennet. Beatrice, she echoed his earlier request. Beatrice, he agreed, a smile tugging at his lips despite the gravity of their situation. And I think the best course of action is for me to take you both to Laramie. You said your sister lives there. Yes, Abigail. She married a shopkeeper named Porter. Beatrice hesitated. But I haven't seen her in years. I wrote to tell her I was coming, but with the coach being robbed. She trailed off, the implications clear. Wyatt considered this. Laramie isn't that big, we'll find her. He busied himself with preparing a meager breakfast from his dwindling supplies. Once we get there, you can start fresh. Beatrice watched him, bouncing Emma gently in her arms. And what about you? Will you return to your cattle operation? That's the plan, he replied, though the thought suddenly seemed less appealing than it had before. It's not much, but it's mine. They ate in companionable silence, sharing the last of Wyatt's jerky and biscuits. By mid-morning, the sun had emerged, turning the snow-covered landscape into a blinding expanse of white. Wyatt saddled Thunder and helped Beatrice secure Emma in a makeshift sling across her chest. It'll be slow going, he warned as he lifted her onto the horse. But Thunder's strong, and Laramie shouldn't be more than a day's ride, weather permitting. Beatrice settled onto the saddle, adjusting Emma's blankets to shield her from the cold. I'm ready. Wyatt mounted behind her, his arms encircling her waist to hold the reins. The proximity was unavoidable, but neither of them commented on it as Thunder began plodding through the deep snow. They rode in silence for the first hour, concentrating on navigating the difficult terrain. Wyatt was acutely aware of Beatrice's slender form pressed against him, of the trust she'd placed in him. It had been so long since he'd been this close to another person that the sensation was almost overwhelming. You mentioned you lost someone, Beatrice said eventually, her voice careful. Was it recent? Wyatt considered deflecting the question, as he usually did when anyone broached the subject, but something about their shared ordeal made honesty feel necessary. 5 years ago, he answered. My wife, Sarah. She was expecting our first child when fever took them both. Beatrice was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, Wyatt, truly. As am I for your loss, he replied. James must have been a good man. He was, she confirmed, her voice soft with memory. A teacher. We met when I was assisting at the schoolhouse in St. Louis. He had dreams of starting a school out west. She glanced down at Emma. He never got to meet her. They continued through the pristine landscape, occasionally stopping to rest Thunder and to care for Emma. By late afternoon, Wyatt estimated they were still several hours from Laramie, and the shortening winter day concerned him. We should find shelter for the night, he suggested as the sun began its descent. Pushing on in darkness would be risky. Beatrice nodded, her exhaustion evident despite her determined silence. Fortune favored them an hour later when they came across an abandoned way station, a simple structure once used for stagecoach stops, but now forgotten as routes had changed. It was in better condition than the previous night's cabin, with a stable for Thunder, and even some forgotten supplies left behind by its former occupants. This is Providence, Beatrice remarked as Wyatt helped her dismount, Emma still sleeping peacefully in her sling. Inside, they found a small stove, some dusty blankets that could be shaken out, and most valuable of all, a store of firewood and basic provisions. Someone was kind enough to leave these for travelers in need, Wyatt observed, examining cans of beans and dried apples. We'll have a proper meal tonight. As Beatrice settled with Emma, Wyatt set about making the station habitable, lighting the stove, preparing food, and ensuring Thunder was comfortable in the stable. By the time darkness fell, they had created a small haven of warmth against the winter night. They ate their simple meal with the enthusiasm of the truly hungry, and for the first time since their meeting, conversation flowed easily between them. Beatrice spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her move to St. Louis to teach, and her whirlwind romance with James. Wyatt shared stories of his cattle drives, the characters he'd met on the frontier, and his dreams of expanding his modest ranch someday. What neither of them directly addressed was the future specifically. What would happen once they reached Laramie and their paths inevitably diverged? Yet the question hung in the air between them, made more poignant by the ease they'd found in each other's company. As the evening wore on, Emma became fussy, and Beatrice walked with her around the small room, humming softly. She likes movement, Beatrice explained when she caught Wyatt watching. Always has, even before she was born. James used to joke that she'd be a dancer. Wyatt smiled. She's got spirit, that's for certain. Survived what would have felled many grown men. She takes after her father that way, Beatrice said, though her eyes remained on Wyatt. He never backed down from a challenge either. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by Emma's occasional coos and the crackling of the stove. Outside, the world was still and silent, the night clear and cold after the storm. "May I?" Wyatt asked suddenly, gesturing toward Emma. Surprise flickered across Beatrice's face, followed by a warm smile. Of course. She carefully transferred the baby to his arms, adjusting his hold to support the tiny head. Wyatt looked down at Emma, marveling at how something so small could radiate such warmth and life. The baby gazed back at him with curious eyes that seemed far too knowing for one so young. "Hello there, Miss Emma," he said softly. "You're quite the brave little lady, aren't you?" Emma responded with a gurgling sound that might have been agreement, her tiny fingers flexing against his rough palm. Something shifted in Wyatt's chest, then a loosening of a knot that had been tied there for 5 long years. Beatrice watched them, her expression unreadable in the dim light. When Emma's eyes began to droop, Wyatt handed her back, their hands brushing in the exchange. "You're good with her," Beatrice observed. "Have you been around children much?" Wyatt shook his head. "Not really. Guess some things just come natural." They prepared for sleep then, arranging the blankets near the stove. As on the previous night, propriety demanded distance, but practicality and the genuine comfort they'd found in each other's presence drew them closer. With Emma nestled between them, they lay facing each other, the stove's glow casting gentle shadows across their features. "Wyatt," Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible above the fire's soft crackling. "What happens when we reach Laramie?" The question he'd been avoiding all day now lay bare between them. Wyatt met her gaze across the small distance that separated them. "What would you like to happen?" he asked, offering her the choice. Beatrice was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Yesterday, I only wanted to reach my sister to find safety for Emma. But now—" She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. "Now things are different," Wyatt completed for her. She nodded. "It seems impossible, doesn't it, that so much could change in the space of a day?" "Not impossible," he replied, "just unexpected, like finding you in that storm." Beatrice smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. "Like Providence," she echoed her earlier word. "Maybe so," Wyatt agreed. "Get some rest, Beatrice. Tomorrow will come soon enough, and with it, whatever's meant to be." She closed her eyes then, but not before Wyatt caught a glimpse of something that might have been hope. As sleep claimed them both, the small way station stood as a sanctuary against the vast wilderness, a place where two broken paths had crossed and, perhaps, begun to intertwine. Morning arrived with clear skies and a renewed sense of purpose. They shared a simple breakfast, packed their meager belongings, and set out toward Laramie with the sun climbing steadily behind them. The journey was easier than the previous day, the path more defined, and by noon they could see smoke from distant chimneys rising against the blue sky. "That's it," Wyatt confirmed. "Laramie." Beatrice's grip on Emma tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's strange. Yesterday I couldn't wait to arrive, now." "Having second thoughts?" Wyatt asked, his voice deliberately light. "Not exactly," she replied. "Just wondering what awaits us there." The us didn't escape Wyatt's notice, nor did it feel presumptuous. Somewhere in the last 24 hours, they had indeed become an us connected by circumstance but bound by something deeper. They rode into Laramie in the early afternoon, drawing curious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing a man, woman, and infant arriving together on a single horse. Wyatt guided Thunder toward the main street, where shops and businesses lined both sides. "Do you know where your sister's husband keeps his store?" he asked. Beatrice shook her head. "The last letter I had from Abigail mentioned it was a general store, but that was over a year ago." "There can't be too many general stores in town," Wyatt reasoned. "We'll find it." They inquired at the first establishment. They came to a hardware store run by an elderly man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Porter's General Goods," the man repeated, eyeing them curiously. "Sure, it's 3 blocks down on the right. Nice folk, the Porters." Relief washed over Beatrice's face. "They're still here." Wyatt guided Thunder in the direction indicated, aware that they were approaching a crucial moment. When they reached the storefront with Porter's General Goods painted in neat letters across the window, he helped Beatrice dismount, then lifted Emma from her arms while she smoothed her travel-worn dress. "You look fine," he assured her, reading her anxiety. "More than fine." She gave him a grateful smile, then took Emma back and squared her shoulders. "Will you come in with me?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words, and Wyatt understood what she was really asking. Would he stay by her side now that they had reached their destination? "Of course," he replied without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere." Together they entered the store, a bell above the door announcing their arrival. The interior was warm and well-stocked, with goods lining shelves from floor to ceiling. A woman behind the counter looked up at their entrance, her features so similar to Beatrice's that her identity was immediately clear. "May I help?" Abigail Porter began before recognition dawned on her face. "Beatrice, is that you, Abigail?" Beatrice breathed, emotion thickening her voice. The sisters rushed to embrace, careful of Emma between them. Tears flowed freely as they held each other, 5 years of separation dissolved in an instant of recognition. "We got your letter," Abigail said, pulling back to look at her sister. "We've been worried sick when you didn't arrive with yesterday's stage. They said there was a robbery." "There was," Beatrice confirmed. "We lost everything, if not for Mr. Daniels here." She turned to Wyatt, who had remained respectfully near the door. Abigail's attention shifted to him, her eyes assessing but kind. "You helped my sister." Wyatt removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his rough appearance after days on the trail. "Found them in the storm, madam. Couldn't leave them out there." A man emerged from the back of the store, George Porter, presumably, and was quickly brought into the reunion. Explanations were shared, introductions made, and before Wyatt quite knew what was happening, he found himself invited to dinner at the Porter's home above the store. "I shouldn't impose," he began, but Abigail waved away his protest. "Nonsense. You saved my sister and niece. The least we can do is feed you properly." Wyatt glanced at Beatrice, who was watching him with an expression that mingled hope with uncertainty. "I'd be honored," he relented. The evening that followed was unlike any Wyatt had experienced in years. The Porter home was modest but comfortable, filled with the warmth of family and the delicious aromas of a home-cooked meal. Abigail fussed over Emma, delighted with her new niece, while George engaged Wyatt in conversation about his cattle operation and the conditions of the trail. Throughout it all, Wyatt was acutely aware of Beatrice's presence across the table, of the way her eyes found his when conversation flowed around them, of the soft smile she reserved for him alone. There was a tentative quality to these exchanges, as if both of them were testing the fragile connection that had formed between them. After dinner, when Emma had been settled in a borrowed cradle and the Porters had discreetly retired to give the sisters time to catch up, Wyatt found himself standing awkwardly in the small parlor, hat in hand. "I should find a room at the hotel," he said, though the thought of leaving filled him with unexpected reluctance. Beatrice approached him, her steps hesitant. "Will you come back tomorrow?" The directness of her question took him by surprise. "Would you like me to?" "Yes," she replied simply. "Very much." Wyatt nodded, a weight lifting from his chest. "Then I'll be here." He left with that promise hanging between them, a bridge to tomorrow that neither had expected to build. The hotel room Wyatt secured was sparse but clean, a luxury compared to their shelter of the previous nights. Yet as he lay on the unfamiliar bed, he found himself missing the sound of Beatrice's steady breathing, the small noises Emma made in her sleep. The silence of the room pressed in on him, making sleep elusive. His thoughts circled around what had happened and what might yet happen. He had ridden into a blizzard alone, and emerged with 2 people who had somehow slipped past the careful guard he'd maintained around his heart for 5 years. The speed of it should have alarmed him, yet there was an undeniable rightness to their connection that defied conventional understanding. Morning found him at Porter's General Goods earlier than was probably proper, but George was already opening up and greeted him warmly. "They're upstairs having breakfast," the shopkeeper informed him with a knowing smile. "Beatrice mentioned you might stop by. Go on up second door on the right at the top of those stairs." Wyatt thanked him and made his way up, Pausing at the indicated door to straighten his freshly brushed coat before knocking, Abigail answered, a dish towel in hand. "Mr. Daniels, good morning. Please join us." The domestic scene that greeted him upon entering stirred something long dormant within Wyatt's chest. Beatrice sat at a small table, Emma in her lap, both of them freshly washed and wearing borrowed clothes that transformed them from the desperate figures he'd found in the snow. Beatrice's hair, now clean and brushed, caught the morning light streaming through the window, highlighting auburn tones he hadn't fully appreciated before. "Wyatt," she said, her face brightening at the sight of him. "You came." "I said I would," he replied, taking the seat Abigail indicated across from Beatrice. Breakfast was a simple but hearty affair, with conversation flowing easily among the four adults. Emma, content after nursing, was passed to Wyatt's arms while Beatrice finished her meal, a gesture so natural. It seemed they'd been sharing such moments for years rather than days. As they ate, practical matters inevitably arose. Beatrice needed to establish herself in Laramie, to find work and create a life for herself and Emma. The Porters were generous in their offers of support, but Wyatt could see Beatrice's determination to stand on her own as quickly as possible. "Mrs. Miller at the dressmaker's shop is looking for help," Abigail mentioned. "She always said you had the finest stitching she'd ever seen, from those samples I showed her." Beatrice nodded thoughtfully. "I could inquire today." "And you're welcome to stay with us until you find your feet," George added. "The spare room is yours for as long as you need it." Throughout this discussion, Wyatt remained quiet, uncertain of his place in these future plans. When breakfast concluded and Abigail began clearing the dishes, he found himself alone with Beatrice, Emma having been settled in her cradle for a morning nap. "You're very quiet," Beatrice observed, studying his face. Wyatt met her gaze directly. "Just thinking about what happens next." "For me and Emma?" she asked. "Or for all of us?" The directness of her question caught him off guard, but he appreciated it. "Both, I suppose." Beatrice's hands folded in her lap, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her gathering courage. "My sister and her husband are kind to offer us a home, and I'm grateful, but I can't help feeling that." She paused, choosing her words carefully, that perhaps there might be another path. Wyatt leaned forward, his voice low. "What kind of path, Beatrice?" "One that includes you," she said simply, lifting her eyes to his. "Is that too forward of me, too presumptuous?" "No," he replied immediately. "Not at all. I've been thinking the same thing." Relief softened her features. "Have you?" "Since the moment we rode into town," he admitted. "Maybe even before." A smile touched her lips, genuine and warm. "It seems impossible, doesn't it, to feel this way after so short a time?" "Maybe," Wyatt conceded. "But I've learned that sometimes life gives you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it, even if you didn't know you were looking." She reached across the table then, her fingers brushing against his. "What are you proposing, Mr. Daniels?" The touch of her hand against his sent warmth spreading up his arm. "I'm proposing that you consider another option. My ranch is small, but it's growing. There's a proper house, not just a cabin, room for a family." He hesitated, then pressed on. "I'm not asking for promises or commitments. Just a chance to see if what started in that storm could become something more." Beatrice didn't withdraw her hand. "And Emma comes with you, of course," Wyatt said without hesitation. "She's part of who you are." Something shifted in Beatrice's expression, then a softening, a opening. "You would take on another man's child?" "I would be honored to," he replied truthfully. "She's extraordinary, just like her mother." Tears gathered in Beatrice's eyes, though her smile remained steady. "How would this work, practically speaking?" "I need to return to my ranch. I've been away too long already," Wyatt explained. But I could come back in a week or two, once you've had time to settle here and think things through. If you decide you want to give us a chance, I'll bring you both home with me." "And if it doesn't work out," she asked, practical even in this moment of possibility. "Then I bring you back to your sister, no questions asked," he promised. "I want you to be sure, Beatrice, both of us should be." She nodded slowly, considering his words. "A week, then, to think." "A week," he agreed, though even that seemed too long now that the possibility had been spoken aloud. The rest of the day passed in a strange mixture of ordinary moments and significant ones. Wyatt accompanied Beatrice to the dressmaker's shop, where Mrs. Miller was indeed eager to hire someone with Beatrice's skills. They walked through Laramie together, Wyatt pointing out places he knew, Beatrice carrying Emma in a proper sling Abigail had provided. To casual observers, they might have appeared to be a young family enjoying an afternoon stroll. The thought both thrilled and terrified Wyatt, who had long ago resigned himself to solitude. That evening, they dined again with the Porters, the conversation comfortable but tinged with the awareness that Wyatt would be leaving the following morning. When it came time for him to return to the hotel, Beatrice walked him to the door. "I'll see you before you ride out tomorrow," she asked, her voice betraying more emotion than her composed features. "First light," Wyatt promised. "I'll come by." She nodded, then, with a glance back to ensure they weren't observed, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Thank you, Wyatt Daniels, for everything." The spot where her lips had touched his skin burned pleasantly as he made his way back to the hotel, his mind already counting the days until his return. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Wyatt arrived at the Porters as promised, his horse saddled and ready for the journey home. Beatrice was waiting, Emma in her arms, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the early morning chill. "I brought you something," Wyatt said, reaching into his saddlebag. He withdrew a small wooden figurine, a horse, roughly carved but recognizable, that he'd purchased from a local craftsman the previous afternoon. "For Emma, something to remember me by until I return." Beatrice accepted it with a smile, turning it in her free hand. "It's lovely, thank you." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, both aware of the watching eyes from neighboring buildings, of the propriety that governed their interaction in this public setting. "1 week," Wyatt finally said. "I'll be back in 1 week." "We'll be waiting," Beatrice replied, her eyes conveying what words could not in such a setting, with a tip of his hat and a final look that carried the weight of promise. Wyatt mounted his horse and rode out of Laramie, his thoughts already turning to preparations for their potential future. The week that followed was the longest of Wyatt's life. He threw himself into work at his ranch repairing fences damaged in the storm, checking on his small herd, and most importantly, preparing the house for potential new inhabitants. He cleaned rooms that hadn't been properly tended in years, repaired furniture, and even rode to a neighboring homestead to purchase extra bedding and a cradle from a family whose youngest had outgrown it. His nearest neighbor, Frank Hollister, observed these activities with knowing amusement. "Either you're expecting royalty, or you've finally found yourself a woman," the older man remarked when he stopped by to help mend a particularly troublesome section of fence. Wyatt didn't deny it. "Met her during the storm. She has a baby daughter." Frank whistled low. "Taking on a ready-made family, are you? That's quite a step for a man who's barely spoken 10 words to anyone in 5 years." "It feels right," Wyatt said simply, driving another post into the frozen ground. Frank nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "When Sarah died, Martha and I figured you'd either drink yourself to death or work yourself into an early grave. Glad to see there was a third option." On the morning of the 7th day, Wyatt set out for Laramie again, his stomach tight with anticipation and nervousness. He'd never been one for prayers, but he found himself offering silent words to whatever power might be listening, asking that Beatrice would choose to give their unlikely connection a chance. The journey seemed twice as long as before, though in reality, it took less time without the hindrance of snow and with his knowledge of the correct path. By late afternoon, he was riding into Laramie, his eyes automatically seeking out Porter's General Goods. George was sweeping the boardwalk when Wyatt approached. The shopkeeper's face broke into a wide smile at the sight of him. "Right on schedule," George remarked. "She's upstairs with the baby." Wyatt dismounted, his mouth suddenly dry. "Has she? Did she mention?" George clapped him on the shoulder. "Better hear it from her directly. Go on up." Taking a deep breath, Wyatt climbed the now familiar stairs and knocked on the door to the Porter's living quarters. It opened almost immediately, revealing Beatrice with Emma in her arms, both dressed in new clothes, presumably products of Beatrice's first week of employment at the dressmaker's. "Wyatt," she said, her voice warm with welcome. "You came back." "I promised I would," he replied, drinking in the sight of her. The week of proper rest and food had restored a healthy glow to her cheeks, and her hair was arranged in a becoming style that framed her face. She stepped back, inviting him in. "Abigail and George have gone to a church meeting. We have some privacy to talk." Wyatt removed his hat as he entered, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. "You look well, both of you." "We are," Beatrice confirmed, gesturing for him to sit. "Laramie has been kind to us. Mrs. Miller is pleased with my work, and Emma is thriving with regular meals and warmth." She settled across from him, adjusting Emma on her lap. "How was your journey home?" "Uneventful," he replied. "And the ranch was as I left it, thankfully." A silence fell between them, laden with the unspoken question that had brought him back to Laramie. "Beatrice," Wyatt began, leaning forward, "I've thought of little else but you and Emma this past week. I meant what I said before I left. I'd like you to consider coming back with me to see if we might build something together." He paused, gathering courage. "But I understand if you've decided that staying here with your sister and a secure position makes more sense." Beatrice regarded him steadily, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. "I've packed our things," she said simply. "We're ready whenever you are." Joy surged through Wyatt, so intense it momentarily robbed him of speech. "You'll come?" He finally managed. "Yes," Beatrice confirmed, her own happiness evident in her bright eyes. "On one condition." "Name it," Wyatt said immediately. "That we agree to be honest with each other always, about our feelings, our fears, our hopes." She looked down at Emma, then back to Wyatt. "I've already had one life cut short by fate. I don't want to waste a moment of whatever time we might have together." Wyatt nodded, understanding completely. "Honesty, always. You have my word." In that moment, Emma chose to offer her own opinion, reaching toward Wyatt with tiny, grasping hands. Beatrice laughed and stood, crossing to where he sat. "She's missed you," she said, transferring the baby to his arms. "As have I." Wyatt cradled Emma, marveling again at how natural it felt. Looking up at Beatrice, he made a decision. "There's something else," he said. "Something I should have said before I left." He took a deep breath. "I know it's fast, probably too fast by most standards, but I've fallen in love with you, Beatrice Bennett, with both of you. I don't expect you to feel the same way yet, but I wanted you to know." Beatrice's eyes widened, then softened. She placed a hand on his cheek, her touch gentle but sure. "It is fast," she agreed. "And yet somehow it also feels like the most natural thing in the world." She bent down until her face was level with his. "I love you too, Wyatt Daniels." Against all logic and convention. Then, with Emma contentedly nestled between them, Beatrice leaned forward and pressed her lips to his kiss that carried the promise of all that might lie ahead. The journey to Wyatt's ranch took 2 days, made longer by traveling with an infant but brightened by the shared anticipation of their future. They stopped frequently for Emma's comfort, camped beneath the stars for one night, and talked endlessly about their pasts, their hopes, and the practical aspects of the life they were embarking upon. When at last they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Wyatt felt a swell of pride mixed with nervousness. "It's not much," he said, gesturing toward the modest house, barn, and corrals spread across the valley below. "But the land is good, and there's room to expand." Beatrice, riding beside him on a gentle mare borrowed from the porters, surveyed the scene with appreciative eyes. "It's beautiful, Wyatt. A real home." Those simple words eased his anxiety. As they rode into the yard, he pointed out various features: the creek that ran year-round, the grazing land beyond the nearest hills, the garden plot that had lain fallow since Sarah's death, but could be revived come spring. Inside the house, Beatrice walked from room to room, Emma in her arms, taking in the simple but solid construction, the clean floors, and the obvious effort Wyatt had made to prepare for their arrival. "You've been busy," she observed, noting the fresh bedding, the stocked pantry, and the cradle positioned near the wood stove in the main room. Wyatt shrugged, pleased by her approval. "Wanted it to be right for you both." That evening, as they shared their first meal in their new home, Wyatt watched Beatrice move about the kitchen with growing confidence, already making the space her own. Emma lay in her new cradle, captivated by a mobile Wyatt had fashioned from carved wooden animals similar to the horse he'd given her in Laramie. "Happy?" he asked when Beatrice joined him at the table. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Completely." The days that followed established a rhythm to their new life together. Wyatt tended to the cattle and the daily operations of the ranch, while Beatrice transformed the house from a mere shelter into a true home. She planted herbs in pots by the kitchen window, hung curtains she fashioned from fabric in her sewing basket, and filled the previously empty shelves with small touches that reflected her personality. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, Wyatt often holding Emma while Beatrice sewed or read aloud from one of the few books they possessed. Sometimes they simply talked, learning the contours of each other's minds as they had already begun to learn the contours of each other's hearts. Physical intimacy developed gradually between them, built on the foundation of trust and mutual respect they'd established. Their first night of true passion came nearly a month after their arrival at the ranch, and afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the quilt Beatrice had brought from her sister's home, Wyatt knew with absolute certainty that he never wanted to be parted from this woman. "Marry me," he whispered against her hair. "Make this official, make us a family in the eyes of God and everyone else." Beatrice propped herself up on one elbow, her hair falling like a curtain around her face as she gazed down at him. "Are you certain?" "Taking me as your wife means taking Emma as your daughter, legally and completely." "I've never been more certain of anything," Wyatt assured her. "I already love her as my own. I want to give her my name, give you both the protection of my name." Tears glistened in Beatrice's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Then yes, Wyatt Daniels, I will marry you." They were wed 2 weeks later in Laramie's small church, with Abigail and George Porter as witnesses and Emma, dressed in a gown Beatrice had sewn for the occasion, cradled in her aunt's arms during the ceremony. The minister, who had known Wyatt since before Sarah's death, seemed genuinely pleased to see him taking this step toward happiness again. "You deserve this," the older man told him after the simple ceremony. "Sarah would have wanted it for you." Wyatt nodded, accepting the blessing with a heart full of gratitude for the past and hope for the future. Their life settled into a pattern of work and joy, challenges and triumphs. The ranch prospered under their joint efforts, with Beatrice proving to be not just a skilled homemaker, but a shrewd partner in the business aspects of ranching as well. Her suggestion to diversify beyond cattle led them to add chickens, a vegetable garden large enough to sell surplus in town, and eventually, a small apple orchard. Emma grew from an infant into a toddler who followed Wyatt adoringly around the ranch, her first word, Dada, bringing tears to his eyes that he didn't bother to hide. By her second birthday, she was the image of her mother in coloring and features, but with a bold, adventurous spirit that Beatrice insisted must have come from Wyatt's influence. On a crisp autumn evening in 1879, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson, Beatrice took Wyatt's hand and placed it against her abdomen. "We're going to need a bigger house," she said softly. Understanding dawned on his face, followed by a joy so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. "You're sure?" she nodded, her smile tender. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. Come spring, Emma will have a little brother or sister." Wyatt gathered her into his arms, his heart so full it seemed impossible it wouldn't burst from his chest. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "God, how I love you, and I you," she replied. "Always and completely." Their son, William, was born on a perfect May morning in 1880, with Emma, now 3.5, peering curiously at her new brother from the edge of the bed. Wyatt held his newborn son with a mixture of awe and gratitude, marveling at how fate had brought him to this moment from the depths of loneliness he'd known just a few years earlier. "He has your eyes," Beatrice observed from her pillows, tired but radiant. "And your chin," Wyatt countered, tracing a gentle finger along the baby's face. "He's perfect." Emma clambered onto the bed, determined not to be left out. "My brother," she declared possessively, carefully touching William's tiny hand. "That's right, sweetheart," Beatrice confirmed, drawing her daughter close with her free arm. "Your brother, forever and always." Wyatt looked at the three of them, his family, his heart, and silently thanked whatever power had sent that blizzard 3 years ago, guiding him to a woman and child huddled in the snow, their lives hanging by a thread. "What are you thinking?" Beatrice asked, noting his expression. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," he replied honestly. "And that sometimes the best things come from the worst storms." She smiled, understanding completely. "Our storm brought us shelter," she said, echoing words she'd spoken on their wedding night, "and our shelter became our home." As if in agreement, William yawned and settled deeper into his father's arms, secure in the knowledge, however instinctive, that he was loved, protected, and part of something enduring. Outside, Wyoming's vast landscape stretched to the horizon, as it had for millennia and would for millennia more. But within the walls of their ranch house, Wyatt and Beatrice Daniels had created something equally enduring in its own way, a family built from chance, choice, and the kind of love that transforms simple survival into true living. By 1890, the Daniels Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous operations in the region. Wyatt and Beatrice had added another daughter, Sarah Abigail, to their family in 1883, and their last child, James Porter, arrived in 1886, a boy with his mother's gentle spirit and his father's determined jaw. Emma, now 17, had blossomed into a beautiful young woman with her mother's grace, and a confidence born of being raised in a home filled with love and respect. She had no memory of the desperate night in the snow that had brought Wyatt into their lives, nor of her biological father. But she knew the stories of both men, one who had given her life, and one who had chosen to make that life his purpose. "Pa," she said one evening as they sat on the expanded porch of their home, watching the younger children playing in the yard. "I've been thinking about going to the teachers' college in Denver next year." Wyatt looked at his eldest daughter, for that was how he thought of her, with no qualifiers or distinctions, with pride mingled with the inevitable sadness of a parent facing a child's departure. "You'd make a fine teacher," he said, recalling how Beatrice had once described Emma's biological father as a teacher with dreams for the West. "Your father would have been proud." Emma smiled, understanding which father he meant. "I like to think so." She paused, then added, "But I know you're proud, and that means everything to me." Wyatt reached over to squeeze her hand, his heart full. "Your mother and I will support whatever path you choose, Emma. Always have, always will." Inside, Beatrice was putting the finishing touches on dinner, helped by William, now 10 and showing a surprising aptitude for cooking. Through the open window, she could hear Wyatt and Emma's conversation, and her eyes misted with grateful tears for the life they had built together. That night, after the children were asleep, Wyatt found Beatrice standing on the porch, gazing up at the stars that spangled the Wyoming sky. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. She leaned back against him, comfortable in the embrace that had become her sanctuary. "I was thinking about that night in the snow," she admitted, "how close we came to never having any of this." Wyatt tightened his hold, remembering the fear that had gripped him when he'd first found her and Emma, barely alive in the blizzard. "But we did have it. We do have it." Beatrice turned in his arms to face him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. At 40, she was more beautiful to him than she had been at 25, her face now marked with the fine lines of laughter and wisdom that came from a life fully lived. "I think about the woman I was then," she mused. "So frightened, so alone. I never imagined I could be this happy." "Nor I," Wyatt confessed. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over for good." Beatrice touched his face, her fingers tracing the contours she knew by heart. "Life has a way of surprising us." "The best kind of surprise," Wyatt agreed, bending to kiss her with the same tenderness that had marked their very first kiss in her sister's parlor, all those years ago. As they stood together under the vast Wyoming sky, the house behind them filled with the sleeping children who were their legacy. Both knew with absolute certainty that the greatest journey of their lives had begun on that winter night when a lost cowboy found a woman with a baby crying in the snow and shared his blanket until morning. In that simple act of humanity, of one soul reaching out to another, in their moment of greatest need, they had found not just survival, but the kind of love that sustains, heals, and ultimately transforms. It was a love born in darkness and nurtured in light, a love that had withstood the tests of time and hardship to grow stronger with each passing year. And as the stars continued their ancient dance overhead, Wyatt and Beatrice Daniels stood wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for the storm that had brought them shelter, the shelter that had become their home, and the home that had become their greatest blessing.